So let me begin just by, as a way of telling you something about me. Within the last 4 weeks, I attended 2 conferences, or 2 events. One was a spiritual meditation retreat with Eckhart Tolle. How many are familiar with him? Okay, good. So, most. So you know the sort of thing that was. Beautiful Lake Louise in Canada. Came back for 5 days, and then I go to a conference of the Society for Scientific Exploration, which actually was in Las Vegas. Just the comparisons of the 2 locations couldn't be more extreme. I'm realizing that. And so that captures my interest, right? I am very much interested in spirituality, direct meditation, direct experience. But I'm also interested in the science that points that way. The Society for Scientific Exploration is a group of scientists, maybe there's one other philosopher, but scientists whose research interests have taken them outside of the official, box of materialist atheism, and so they can't get published in their mainstream journals. And so they founded an organization together and a journal where they encourage, promote, and talk about the study of spirituality. Now, okay, let me begin. So I did, last few days, write up some notes about what I was going to talk about, and then do I bring them or not? And I forgot them. But if I don't know this material well enough to talk it, I have no business standing up in front of you. So how many here believe that reincarnation or something like that is true? Okay, almost everyone. Now if I ask you, why do you believe it? What will you say?
Been there, done that.
Been there, done that? How about a little more, put a little more flesh on that? It feels right to you?
It feels right to me. I remember things from the past.
Oh, you have some memories?
Yeah, rare. But
Okay.
I was on my back porch and was visited by an orb, and I just know it had to be a spirit form.
Okay, isn't that interesting?
Unexplained phenomena that's happened that connects me to it, to be really honest.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
This is a little bit different from everyone else's, but I kind of think it seems logical with nature. If nature has cycles, and
That was my path. I was reading the stuff that's in your library, the Indian texts and Plato, and they talked, and it just seemed like okay, right. But no one mentions that the reason you believed it is because you studied the research of Ian Stevenson, right, who, as a scientist, studied reincarnational cases and came to the conclusion that it's real. Right? How many have heard of Ian Stevenson? Okay, so he was one of the founders of the Society for Scientific Exploration, right? And he couldn't get anyone to pay attention to him. So he and another person, Robert John. How many have heard of Bob John? Okay, and how many have heard of PAIR, the Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research Lab? Okay, Bob John was head of engineering who founded that. He passed recently. And the question he asked was, can the human mind affect, you're flipping a coin, because they do that now by machines, so you can flip a coin a zillion times per second, right? Can the human mind, by intention, influence or get a deviation from chance with that? And the answer is yes. And it's a small effect, but you have to know your statistics. The odds of this happening by chance are something like a 10 trillion to 1. So here you have scientific data that suggests or points towards the hypothesis that the mind does influence matter. And so Robert John was one of the founders, he and Ian Stevenson. I think there was a third guy that that founded the Society for Scientific Exploration, and they're still going strong. How many have been to a healer? How many have felt benefited? Now, if I ask you, why did you go to a healer? My guess is probably word of mouth, right? I mean, that's why I went. But wouldn't it be nice if someone would go to a healer and says, well, I went to a healer because I read a bunch of controlled studies that showed that healing is effective, that it really does work, and there's hard science behind it. Okay, so I am very hopeful that this is what it will take to turn the corner on this. Science and, of course, science and religion have been battling each other since the 17th century. And I make a sharp distinction between religion and science, religion and spirituality. Religion is a belief in fixed beliefs. I believe this, I believe that. Spirituality is open to direct experience. It does not involve, beliefs might be involved or might be useful, but it's not about having the right beliefs that will get you into heaven. Okay? So, I feel that the work that these scientists are doing in parapsychology is really tipping the scales a bit. Science and humanities especially is still very much under the influence of materialist paradigm, the materialist atheist paradigm. And it will take a while, I think, before the universities change. But there's so much evidence now about the reality of spirituality that it's getting harder and harder to deny it. But some of my former colleagues have their heads so deeply into the sand that no matter how many experiments, how much data, it'll never happen. You know this quip, I think it's Max Planck. One of the founders of the quantum theory was irritated that many of his colleagues could not wrap their minds around the new ideas. They're quite radical. And he said, science does not advance because new theories are proposed or new data happens. Science advances because people eventually die. Right? The older generation dies, and a younger generation whose minds are not so fixed and rigid can see these new ideas. So the quip now is science advances one funeral at a time. And I think that's, there's a lot of truth to that. And the scientists I hang out with, obviously, at in these groups, I really do believe it. There's, I will call it ordinary parapsychology. I call it ordinary because it's what people think of when they think of parapsychology. Card guessing, influencing random number generators, mind over matter, does healing work, a clairvoyance. You know what they call clairvoyance now? I heard a wonderful talk about that. They call it remote viewing. You've heard of remote viewing, right? Right, and you know that it was the Army or CIA was using remote viewers and they got actionable information, but they couldn't acknowledge publicly that this stuff is real, So let me just state right now what I think is the philosophical bottom line, and then I want to go on to where I think the science is really becoming very deep and profound. The bottom line is this, is that consciousness is not created by the brain. Okay? Of course, while associated with the body, it is associated with the brain, and so there are going to be correlations. But the consciousness that we experience ourselves as being is independent of the brain. There's hard data on that. It's not just a metaphysical belief. The second is, and this has been said by so many teachers in so many ways, the individual consciousness that we experience ourselves as being, all these individual consciousness taken together of all beings constitute a single one mind or one consciousness, We are all part of the same one being. Now, you've seen that in other venues, like panentheism, for example, is we are not just created by the divine being, but we are the divine being expressing himself itself in this form. So that also has tremendous support, empirical support. Larry Dossey, a physician, wrote a book called One Mind. And I think it's 40 short chapters, each one of which gives you like a little vector that points to that hypothesis. Oh, we're all in this together, right? So these two beliefs, until very recently, were just beliefs or hypotheses of philosophical ideas. And the idea that there can be evidence, empirical evidence, for something that was heretofore considered philosophy or theology can be very upsetting to philosophers and theology and theologians, because science is invading their territory, so to speak. But of course, it's my favorite philosopher, or one of my favorite philosophers, Spinoza, once said, is there anything that we cannot ask why it is? And the answer is no, there isn't. Right? And so, spirituality, the mind, the nature of consciousness, we can all ask why. Well, okay, so there's all this parapsychological research that's been going on for a long time. But recently, there are three offshoots of it that collectively, no, four maybe, is called survival research. So you can see the question, can the human mind influence the throw of dice? Okay, yes, no, take it to Las Vegas or whatever. But it's not directly relevant to, do I survive the death of my body? That's what I really want to know. So there's this whole area called, which is my first time writing on a board since I quote, retired. I've been busier since I retired than before. I don't know how I had time to teach. So which was my favorite part of survive. I was never a good speller. And my handwriting or board writing always left something to be desired. But survival research. So these are, I'll talk about four areas of research that I'm familiar with. Well, let's go to the one that I mentioned first, reincarnation. I mean, how could you measure something like that? You can't just watch somebody die and follow their soul as it leaves the body, goes someplace, then comes back into a little infant or something like that. You can't do that. So how do you do it? Well, how many are familiar with the kinds of cases Stevenson researched? So very brief review. So Stevenson was a psychiatrist in the, I think his work began in the late 50s and 60s. I believe his first book was late 60s or early 70s, 20 cases of the reincarnation type. And he'd heard stories of children with memories of, before I was born, right, I was so-and-so in such and such town and blah, blah, blah. And he found these cases curious. And so he got people, he called them my informants, in India, Ceylon, Pakistan, in cultures where reincarnation would be talked about. Apparently such cases there are common, or certainly not uncommon. And he would go and interview the child, the parents, the friends. If the child said, I was such and such in a town, blah, 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 and I was killed this, blah, and such, he would go to that town, interview people, talk to them, and get this kind of data. And his case studies are very rich and very detailed, more detailed than someone like me cares to know. But it was very, very meticulous. And he found many, many cases that there was no other explanation, that children's memories were real. It's not just that the kid had a memory, but the kid had an emotional response that was appropriate to the situation. One case stands out. The kid, say 3 or 4-year-old, is taken to the town where he said he had a past life. And he sees a man on the street and he says, "You owe me money." And imagine being accosted by a 3-year-old or 4-year-old saying, "You owe me money." And it turned out that the guy who he said he was had died, and this other man had owed him a certain amount of money. I don't know if he collected. But you get cases like that all the time.
What is the author's name?
Pardon?
What's his name, the author?
Stevenson.
Stevenson.
Okay. Trial research. So this goes with the name of Ian Stevenson. And I think, but his student, or a student of his, Jim Tucker, also a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist actually, Jim Tucker, is a much better writer than Stevenson. So I recommend, unless you're interested in the history of this, skip this, go to Jim Tucker. I used to use one of his books, Life Before Death, in my class. I think it's a model of reasoning. He presents a case, this is what happened, this is the data, and he goes through every hypothesis that you could think of logically that, well, if this were true, that would explain this. And the only hypothesis standing is, yeah, that kid was that person. Now, since Stevenson died, a number of cases have been found in the West. One is, have you heard, anyone read the book Soul Survivor? Fascinating case.
I have it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, no, you won't be able to put it down. And it was written by the father of the kid who tried to disprove what the kid was saying. The father was a typical Southern Christian type, and he recalls saying, "There'll be no talk of reincarnation in my house," right? But just briefly, just so you can see how detailed the case. The kid was having nightmares of a plane falling from the sky, and the nightmares continued. He had an obsession with World War II planes. To make a long story short, his past life was an American, well, I guess it was the Navy, probably from the Navy, because the plane took off from the ship, but he was shot down by the Japanese. He gave the name of the carrier and the kind of plane that he flew. He knew that the plane had certain kinds of problems with the landing gear that was habitual, and that turned out to be accurate. He got the names of some of his buddies, and they turned out to be real. And the father took the kid to a reunion of that ship, like the 50th reunion, and he went around identifying some of the guys. And one of the guys, they were 80 years old, and it was, "Well, how did you recognize me?" He said, "Well, your voice is the same." So this was a 6, 7, I don't know if he's 8, how old he is at this time. It ended, or at least the book ended, with a very, there are many, many more details that the kid remembered. And including the guy's sister was still alive, and the kid had some details, intimate details of their family life and what it was like that only the sister knew. So got confirmed that way. But it ended with this very moving story with the Japanese government, right? The government that shot this guy down, right? Took the kid to the exact place in the water, and where the plane was shot down, and they did some kind of ceremony. And they said the kid cried for 2 or 3 hours, and then it was gone. It was completely gone. So there have been very moving. It just brings tears to your eyes. And that's another thing. Why do these things move us so deeply if they're not true, right? Yes, we know. So Jim Tucker has several books, and I think his last book has American cases, and he does have this guy in it, but I think the book by the kid's father has many more details, and it's more, I mean, see, these two guys are scientists. And with scientists, it's a little bit, do you remember the old, and now you're too young to remember, but when I was a kid, we had Dragnet on television, right? Right. Just the facts, ma'am. Just, he's breaking the news while your husband was murdered here, and this woman starts crying. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. So the scientists tend to be interested in just the facts, but the full emotional impact of this, I think, is part of the facts. So there are these reincarnation cases, and they keep coming. Obviously, you have to wait for them. Right? You can't go out and make something like that happen. But there are other areas, and this is a question of debate among the scientists I hang out with. They tend to be a little less sympathetic, but I think they're mistaken. So the use of hypnotic regression to induce past life memories in people, Brian Weiss and a few others do this. So I think that's real, and the people who do go through that are changed by that process. So I think that is a source of information. But the scientific type are a little bit skeptical about that. Under hypnosis, you're going to tell the hypnotist what he wants to hear, right? Because you want to please him, and so they go into all of this stuff. But the kids have these statements. You write them down, and then you can. True, false, true, 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 right? And then you can, by objective methods of sociology, psychology, whoever studies, these things. So, again, without exception, every scientist who's looked at this in detail has come away with the only rational conclusion possible, which is that we are not our bodies. That which is our identity survives the death of our body. Which is very important. It's important to know that. If we cannot die, I mean, that should make a difference in our lives. Okay, so there was another famous case, a British case. British, they remembered a past life in Ireland, in a poor fishing village. And she had 5 small children, and she had some illness and died. And her last thought was, who's going to take care of the children, right? It was all with the children. So now, fast forward, 50 years, she's a woman in Britain. She has these memories that don't fade. That's unusual. These memories usually fade by the time the kid is 7 or 8 or 9. Right? But in her case, it didn't fade. And when she was an adult, I think she's 30 or 40, she gets it together and she goes to this town, starts talking to people, and she starts, yes, there was a woman here whose name was such and such, and yes, she did have she verified all that. She went to orphanages and through the church. She located 4 of, I think, her 5 children who were still alive. And this brought tears to my eyes. On some TV show, you had 4 men, 75 to 90, and a 45-year-old woman, and they were saying, that's my mom. They were convinced she was their mom. Why? Because she could relate to them events that only the 2 of them experienced, or 3 of them experienced together, right? Now, this is in a town, small town Ireland, reincarnation, right? No way, right? You probably won't even find it in the bookstores. How did these 4, 80-year-old guys, right, come to be? You could have convinced me because maybe I want to believe and I'm looking for evidence. Maybe that's true for most of us here, but not in Ireland, right? So this was very just powerful to see them on the stage like that together. Okay, so reincarnation. So these cases still going on, and but let's look at the next one, which is probably the most controversial of these areas. Well, they're all controversial if you're talking to a materialist atheist, but it's mediums, or mediumship, whatever you want to call it. There was a time in my life where I believed in spirituality. I thought that the Hindu texts and the Buddhist stuff was good. I read all the Christian mystics, and I thought, yes, this stuff is real. There is this transcendent state of consciousness. But I thought I had a negative judgment about all this in-between stuff. You know, magic tricks or this ability or that psychic stuff. And I thought mediums were just a bunch of, fakes until I started looking into it. And the person who convinced me that mediums are real, this may surprise you, but he's one of my favorite philosophers, was William James. Anybody familiar with the James and mediumship? Okay. So his positive assessment of the famous Boston medium, Mrs. Piper, gave me permission to research it. Oh, if this was convincing to James, let me take a look at it. So I looked at the historical cases, and then at some point, turned out somebody I knew was developing her mediumship abilities. And because I knew her before she became a trance medium, I was there with her process of doubting, questioning, how do I know it's real, and all this. And she would begin by just like getting messages for various people. We were in workshops at the time, and giving them, say, here, this probably doesn't mean anything, and it turned out to be the most meaningful thing, that they read for the month. So she gradually began to trust it. So here I knew that at least this one medium was very skeptical and needed proof to be convinced that she wasn't going crazy. I think at a time she was volunteering in a psych ward, and she knew where they put people who hear voices, right? And then when she realized it's not hearing voices, it's what the voices are telling you. If what they're telling you is to go kill the person sitting there, then maybe you shouldn't listen to them and be worried and take your meds. But if what they're saying is benign and mostly accurate and always benign, right, then maybe give it a shot. Well, so since then, I've personally gone to mediums who were recommended to me. Oh, go to so-and-so. She's good. I always go a little bit skeptical. I believe in the general possibility thereof, but how do I know that this is a case in point? Right. So I usually have that attitude. But I've had enough visits, enough experiences just to be okay with it. And at some point, if I write my memoirs, it will include like how mediums have shaped and structured my life. I have a book that I've donated here, so you can get it for free, and another book coming out early next year. It would not have been possible without the guidance and proddings of mediums. Or the mediums will say, well, it's not me, right? It's the spirit that's coming through, right? So, okay, so they found a way to reach me. But now, the reason I went to see a medium is because of my own interest, curiosity, and friends, recommending it. But it's not because Gary Schwartz did double-blind controlled studies on mediums and found that they were accurate. Right? So here the science comes. Science is lagging a little bit. But we have, I'd say today, the two most prominent. Now I hesitate because you read the original book, a paper, and then 3 years later you read an article, this work has been duplicated by so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. So the work has all been duplicated, I think, at European schools. So this is Gary Schwartz, SCA. And, oops, Julie Beischel. I'm not sure if it's, maybe it's the I's before E. And her work, you can look her up or Google the Windbridge Institute, because she does it under those auspices. I think it's Windbridge, well, Windbridge something, Institute or whatever. Her work, I think, is a little tighter than his. She was, before she got into this, her doctorate is in pharmacology. So how do you go from pharmacology to doing medium research? Well, you'll have to sit down with her, have a long talk. It's an interesting story. Is there a T with Schwartz? TZ? I can't spell Schwartz. Okay. So she's got 20 research, she calls them research mediums, my research mediums. What does that mean? It means that they've devoted 30 or 40 hours to testing them, maybe more, under controlled conditions, laboratory controlled conditions, double and triple blind, where the medium never meets the person they're sitting for, or they're giving a reading for. They're given just the first name of someone, and so. With very, very accurate results, odds against chance, blah, blah, blah. All these people, they know how to. I guess if you give odds against chance, then that makes your paper scientific, right? So the question, can some people communicate with deceased people? And the answer is unequivocal. Yes, it happens. That's the fact. Okay? Why do we think it's a fact? Well, go look and see the data that's collected under very controlled conditions. Okay? I could give you more information about the experimental arrangement that leads to this, but you see, until now, I think, people had different opinions. Right? Well, my opinion is that mediums are all fake, or my opinion is that maybe some mediums have some talent, but most of them are blah, blah, blah. Or my opinion is that, well, when you're dead, you're dead. Nobody's ever come back from the dead, right? Well, apparently that's false. They come back all the time. Pardon? Okay, so I think you can see what's happening and why some people get, mainline scientists can get upset, because as well as some theologians. I'll have a story about that. Because until now, what you believed about this, about God, afterlife, purposeful, this is a personal matter, right? That's personal. What you believe about molecules, about, material engineering, that's not personal, because the facts and data is out there, right? You can believe false things about it, but then you're not in reality anymore, right? If, say, water consists of molecules, each of which is 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, right? Now, if I says, well, that's your belief. I have a different belief about the nature of water. I think it's 3 atoms. Well, there might have been a time in the history of science when that was an open option, right? We just didn't know, but now we know, and it's not an open option, right? You don't have the right to have it. Well, you can be crazy if you want, but you don't have a right not to believe that water is H2O, because the data is so there, if you want to be a rational human being. Well, so these things that were once a matter of personal belief, when science gets to them and gets repeatable data with the right statistical analysis, et cetera, and the conclusion is, hey, this is real, then it seems to me you don't have a choice. If you're a person of reason or a rational human being, then okay, it's been established by science. I might come back to this. Obviously, not all how many have been to a medium here? About a third. not all mediums have the same ability. And there are some stars and superstars. You see them on TV sometimes. And then there are people who get it sometimes, and they'll have good days, they'll have bad days. So just because a medium isn't 100%, see, some skeptics will say, well, if they get something wrong, then obviously it doesn't work. And this is what Gary Schwartz emphasizes. He says, no, they don't have to get everything right. They just have to get everything righter than chance. So if chance would say, let's say it's, you're guessing what suit of card is that you're going to pick. You've got 1 in 4 chances, right? So the average, by chance, you should be right 25%. Well, if somebody is right 60% of the time, but not 100, but 60, that's still way beyond chance. And so there's a real effect here. So that's what he was getting with his mediums. They weren't right 100% of the time, but they're right way beyond chance. Okay, the next thing, and I think this is the biggest thing, at least now, is the near-death experience. How about NDE? So how many were here? The last time I came here was for Eben's talk. Okay, great. So I probably saw you then, or at least a little bit. Eben's an amazing guy, and he has given a boost to the whole science and spirituality stuff, because here's this practicing brain surgeon, totally encased in the materialist atheist worldview, totally, right? And then he has this experience, and which completely changes, and which says something about the power of that experience, because usually people's experiences conform to their prior beliefs and expectations, right? That's usually the case. In his case, it just blew away everything that he believed about the brain. You imagine that, a brain surgeon. He has a near-death experience, and that experience blows away everything that he was taught about the brain. Okay, so that's very, very powerful. Coalescing in his personalities, both science and spirituality. And there's no stopping him. I mean, he's just totally into it. You see the energy that he had. I think the room was arranged differently, wasn't it? Yeah, I remember it. He was up there. He's getting a lot of attention, but also the skeptics are out full force trying to find a way to debunk him. But it's not going to happen. Now, back in the late 70s, when I was first getting into this, I was team teaching a course with one of the chaplains of the school. I think it was a Methodist, but I'm not 100% sure. And I remember talking to him about the near-death experience. And because I had just read about it. I think I just read Moody's book. And, what do you make of this and all that? And to my surprise, he was ridiculing it in the same way that my atheist materialist colleagues were. And so I confronted him. I said, look, this is something that you or your religion officially believes in, right? Immortality of the soul, that we are responsible for how we behave, right? Because there are ethical things that come out of this in the life review, et cetera, et cetera. And he thought for a moment, and he says, yeah, but the basis of my belief is faith. If this could be scientifically proven, there'd be no need for my faith. Well, I knew then that the near-death experience was between a rock and a hard place in terms of getting the attention of the people who should be giving it attention, which is, theologians on the one hand, religious people, right? They should be knocking down the doors of near-death experiences. But they're frightened to death that something might come out that'll be different from their theology, which is why religion and theology is belief-based or faith-based, whereas spirituality is evidence-based. Right? It's based on, well, this is what I experience. Okay. Now, what is it about the near-death experience that makes it so evidential, that's so strongly evidential for the hypothesis that consciousness is independent of the brain? Could it be that, you know, somehow the last gasps of a dying brain, or they're fantasizing, all the stuff has been looked at and examined and shown not to be the case. But there's a particular, well, there's more than one, but it's a very strong kind of evidence. So if I claim, say, I can leave my body at will, and how would you devise a test to prove it or disprove it? Seems to me the test is obvious. Go in the next room, or go home, go in my kitchen and tell me what's on the table. Right? And if I get that right, then that should be evidence that I can actually leave my body and travel someplace. Okay? If this happens to be correlated with the time that my heart is not beating and no blood is flowing to my brain, then whatever it is I'm doing, the brain isn't doing it, right? Because the brain is doing nothing. So recently there was a book, and I reviewed it for the Journal of Near-Death Studies, so I got into it in quite detail. And the guy, they were Dutch guys, and they collected over 100 cases that are evidential of that kind. The book is called The Self Does Not Die. So it's got some of the famous cases. You probably all heard of the Pam Reynolds case. It's got that case. But it has some cases I never heard of. And these would be cases where, so I'll give you one example that stands out in my mind. So a person is being operated on for something or other, and I think it's a she, I'm not sure. She basically dies on the operating table. Her heart stops, no blood is going to the brain, she's coded or whatever. And so let's say she's gone for 3 or 4 minutes. No heartbeat, no blood going to the brain. During those 3 or 4 minutes, there's stuff going on, right, in the operating room. The doctors, they're talking, they're yelling, they're this or they're that. Okay. They revive the patient. When the patient comes to, she reports having seen everything from the point of the ceiling. She reports in detail everything that they said, what they talked about, and the procedure, the medical procedure. First you did this, and then somebody came with a funny looking instrument here and did that, right? And this doctor was swearing, and right? All exactly right. So her experience, her subjective experience, was time anchored to a time when we know that the body was not working. The heart wasn't beating, nothing was going to the brain. So that brain was not producing that experience. If you're a materialist, right, you believe that the brain produces every experience, right? But a brain that's not working at all can't produce anything, let alone something from the point of view of the ceiling. And this person, I think there was a case where the person had what do you call these, like a tic, just needing to memorize everything. And there was apparently a 9-digit serial number on top of a device where the lights were, or some machine was, that could only be seen if you were 10 feet tall, right, or hovering at the ceiling. Well, she got that, and she got the serial number down accurately. So, yeah, over 100 cases like this. Another one, a famous Dutch case. A guy comes in, he's hit by lightning or something. They bring him in from a golf course. Nothing's going on in his body, and they work to bring him to. And when he came to, they couldn't find his dentures. And so what had happened? After a day or so of nothing, the patient recognizes a nurse. It was a male nurse, and says, "You're the one who took the dentures out of my mouth. Where did you put them?" He was exactly right. But when you looked at his medical records, there was no way he could have seen or heard anything at that time, given the state his brain was in. So this is sometimes called veridical perception, right? They're having perceptions that veridical means true or verified, occurring at a time when the brain is known not to be working, basically. So he had about 101, 102 such cases like that. There are probably many, many more because not everything gets reported. That. But there's something else about this. Is DeLacy? No, she's not here. Some of you know DeLacy, right? No? Okay. Well, we had dinner before coming here, which was a good omen because I would have been late. I allowed 2 hours to drive from Evanston, and I was 15 minutes late for our dinner. And we both knew this guy, Steve, who passed recently. And he was a historian, a history professor at UIC. And what brought us together is that he had had a near-death experience and became interested in that. And of course, I was always interested in that. And so we talked about it. And his experience focused on one component of the near-death experience called the life review. Now, this is very threatening to our way of life in America, or maybe anywhere in the world, but especially in America. So let me tell you what he experienced. And this is very typical. He said, look, you experience your life from 3 or 4 perspectives all at once. One is the third person perspective. You're sitting there watching a screen and there it is. The other is first person perspective. You are re-experiencing, reliving everything you did, every thought you had, every emotion that you had. He said, all this is going on simultaneously. He says, the third perspective is you experience your life the way everyone that you interacted with experienced you. You experience their feelings, their emotions, as they were interacting with you. Well, that's scary, right? The first time I heard that, I went everything I did wrong, basically, or everything that I would do differently now, which is a more positive way of putting it. But many people have not been kind to others. And in some ways, if you're a money-chasing, a career-chasing American, the probability is you've been unkind to many. You've stepped on many people to get ahead. You think of that phrase, get ahead. Who are you getting ahead of? Your fellow human beings? Causing sorrow to them? Just like you'd feel sorrow when somebody gets ahead of you? So this whole getting ahead business is not in harmony with spiritual reality. So they come back from this experience. Every unkind word they said to another, they feel as happening to them, as having happened to them, the unkindness that the other felt. I probably shouldn't be political, but I sometimes, when I think of our president, and I know what's in store for him, I feel compassion. I don't know if there's anybody on the planet who's harmed as many people as he has. His life review will last a very long time. So, but you see how threatening this is to those who have internalized the value of let's get ahead, let's make it, right? Let's beat everybody else, right? You know, and I remember this went back, I remember memories from my childhood, you know, on the back of a cereal, be the first kid on your block to have this, you know, lucky charm or the secret code to this, right? Why was it important to be the first kid on the block, right, with this? So that's, I think, an American ideology, is to we measure our self-worth through comparison with others, right? That's a wrong way to live, and that's coming through through this, because these people are changed, and they're changed permanently, and they have a real tough time adjusting to, with the given the values that they've learned. Basically, it's the Sunday school value, the golden rule, right? That's how we should be living our life. They have a real hard time readjusting to life here. I remember Steve and I, so we got to be friends, we did some committee work together, and when two faculty get together, who do they talk about? I should say, what do they talk about? Who do they talk about? Well, it's either the administration or the students, right? And kvetching, complaining about it. It's the most natural thing in the world. So he was saying something negative about one of the deans, and he caught himself. And he sort of said, I have to be careful because, everything I do, I think, how's this going to play out in my next life review? But I think it's maybe excusable to say negative things about the deans and administrators, and maybe a few students too. I don't know. But so that taught me a bit. Okay, the fourth thing I can see, had no idea I could talk this long. So the fourth thing, does anybody know what this is? ADC. These acronyms have changed over the years, and even now they're given different names. Anybody know what it stands for? After-death communication. Many people, maybe up to 50% of the people, feel that a loved one has communicated with them in some way after dying. And the communications range in form from, he was sitting right there, I could see him, right? To more vaguely, I seemed to sense his aftershave lotion, or something vague like that. But they felt it was real, but it was not like quite seeing right there. More like hearing a voice or feeling the energy of. This is fairly common in our culture. Has anybody had such an experience? Yeah, I have too. In fact, has anyone had one? So mine happened before I was into any of this. I was a teenager. It was my grandfather. But before I share that, I don't know if I want to say. Has anyone had an after-death communication in which you felt information was communicated to you that you did not know? Okay, so if you didn't know it, you can't be making it up. You know what I mean? It can't be a subconscious thing. So anyway, these things have been studied or are being studied, but there's one guy whose work I want to mention. Anyone ever heard of Alan Botkin? So he's a psychotherapist. He's up north somewheres. And he has devised a way to induce after-death communications in many of his patients. And some of you, do you know this technique in therapy, the eye movement? It involves a modification of the rapid eye, of the eye movement technique, and then the person has a full-blown after-death communication. And I asked him to give me, he has a book out on that, and I asked him to give me an example, and he said, he worked for much of his life in a veterans hospital. So he's working with veterans. And many veterans are carrying awful memories of seeing children burn, maybe from the very napalm that they had dropped, or seeing kids die, maybe because of their own bullets. And so he talks about with one client, he got this technique, and the girl, the last time he saw her, she was burning to death from napalm. That memory etched in his mind. With this technique, the girl comes, she's radiant, she's happy, she's healthy, not carrying any anger. And can you imagine the healing that does for somebody who's been carrying that around for 30 years? So his book is called Induced After-Death Communications. That's a real good read.
What's his name?
Pardon?
What's his name?
Alan. And I think just to give you an idea of how wild some of the science is, so Gary, a few years ago, I see him at a conference and I said, well, hey Gary, how have you been? What are you doing? What are you doing these days? Because I knew he'd stopped mediumship research in a formal way. And he goes, would you believe I'm talking to angels? Like that. I don't think there are many other people at the conference who would believe that, but I say, with you, Gary, yes, I believe it. And what he's got, now this is, it's nice for me to know that there are people even further out than I am. But he's coming up with the idea of a soul phone. So you could just call grandma or something like that. And his basically, it was a proof of concept experiment. So he's got this Faraday cage, this tightly, no light can get in or whatever. And he's got some device inside. And he's asking spirit to interact with the device, if it can interact with the device in any way. Extract a photon from the vacuum or whatever. But that's not enough, because there could be a stray photon here and there or whatever. So he has, say within a 1 hour period, say 2 to 3 in the morning, he's got a random number generator or some that will randomly select time periods within that hour. So between 10 and 10:11, between 10:21 and 10:22, between 10, whatever. But he doesn't know what those periods are, so he can't influence it psychically. You got to rule this stuff out. And so he gets basically that spirit can activate the lights at the times that he says. And that's all you need to get communication going, to have a yes, no, on, off thing. So he's kind of working with that. And the last time I talked with Evan Alexander, he was in touch with Gary, and he thought it was workable. So these things are happening very quickly. Not all these ideas are going to pan out, of course, but once you've proven to your satisfaction that consciousness is not a function of the brain, survives, right? Okay, then the question is just applying it. And the same thing with healing, right? Once you, there's a guy, Bill Bankston, so this is from the SSE. Now this is not directly related to survival research, but he's been able to cure mice of cancer just by holding the cage in his hands. And he's got some technique for doing that. He's trained students to do it. And the mice recover from cancer that's otherwise fatal. The mice is then immune to cancer, and he's trying to bottle it. It's almost like the idea of holy water. You treat the water in some way, and then the water that once treated, when drank by his mice or whatever, it cures the cancer. So these are wild and crazy ideas that are actually occurring within this new paradigm. Okay, if spirit is real, let's work with it. We can actually do controlled and measurable experiments and get results. So what it shows is that Spinoza is right. There's nothing of which we cannot ask why, and use our, common sense, the brains that God gave us, to figure it out. We don't need to accept any of this on sort of unreasoned faith. So that's what I like to see. And for me, it is a coming together of my two main interests, spirituality and science.
Thank you for this lecture. It was
Sure.
very interesting. I wanted to ask you, it's directly why you think it's important that spirituality be scientifically or empirically validated, and what you think about the idea of spirituality transcending concepts and transcending language and symbols. And is it possible that we're comparing metaphorically prose to poetry, that we can learn from either, but they're different points of view? Thank you.
Oh, I like that. Well, let's look at that prose poetry analogy. Of course, if the prose writers or the poets had been fighting and arguing for centuries, and now we can tell them, hey, you're saying the same thing here in different ways, okay, then that's a step forward. I think another way to frame what you're saying is I take spirituality to be the actual experience, whereas science is building concepts that will enable us to understand or work with these experiences, something like that.
But is that necessary? And can we understand the lessons or the insights that are that we can gain from spirituality? Is it reductionism to then bring them into concepts and language
No,
as opposed to experiential?
No, it's not, because the very first thing about the near-death experience is that everyone, without exception, says, there's no way I can put this into words.
Right. That's what
Right?
I'm saying.
But that becomes part of the data, right? One can report that near-death experience, a state about their experience that it cannot be put into words. Okay? You see that becomes then a fact about the experience. Let me approach maybe your question from just another point of view, a more personal point of view. So, was at the last visit, I'm having dinner with Eben and Karen, and Eben's talking about the belief, the materialist belief, and how his experience wiped that clean, and we need to study these things to get our science aligned with spirituality. And then Karen said, I don't know anything about science, but I've always believed in this. I've always believed that consciousness is not a product of the brain. It just seemed ridiculous to believe what Eben, her partner, used to believe. So she didn't need any of this stuff, right? Because she was there, her heart was there. It just felt right. She didn't need to be convinced. She didn't need to, but that wasn't my path, right? My path was through the concepts, through trying to figure it out up here, and I came to experience later. But I think the two go together beautifully. The two enhance each other. I don't think Eckhart needs science, right, to validate what he is experiencing. And the people who go to Eckhart and benefit from being with him do not need science to validate what they experience. But the science is there.
What's the prevailing theory about why these things don't happen commonly, like all the time?
Which things?
Well, near-death experiences, reincarnation.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, these things happen more often than people think, but they're not reported. And that's true for many of these kinds of experiences. There's a sense that they're underreported because people have judgments about them. Here, this is once you start studying this, scientifically, some very interesting things happen. Why doesn't everyone who is brain dead and heart doesn't beat for a few minutes, why don't they all report near-death experiences? I think the number is between 15 and 20%. So now, most hospitals, this wasn't the case way back, but I think now it is. At most hospitals, if somebody's been operated on or cardiac arrest or something like that, they'll ask them, did anything, when you were in the operating room, did anything unusual happen? About 80% say no, 82% say no, 15, 18% say yes. Why not everybody? Why just, how no explanation whatsoever. And some people would say, well, what that shows is it's not being controlled from our side. You cannot put somebody in a physiological state and guarantee that they will then have a near-death experience just because you've stopped their heart. stop blood from flowing to their brain. So in a sense, it's being controlled from the other side. But just don't know. Now mediums will say that this, or this, you're walking down the street, you get a hunch, or you get something comes to you. Now, could it have been sent by Grandpa? Right? Once you're open to that possibility, then maybe it's not that uncommon. I had one of these that I did not recognize for what it was until 25 years later. In my dream, my grandfather came to me, and I thought there was a language barrier between us. I was 16 when he died. And at the time, my parents were very typical, say, Jewish atheists, right? So if any of you from that culture, you know the mindset. He hated all religions, his own the most. So now I think, well, maybe not without some reason. So I thought because my grandfather did rituals, he would light the candles of the Sabbath, say the prayer at Passover. I thought that only unintelligent people were religious. That was my upbringing. Only unintelligent people are religious. But I sensed that my grandfather was intelligent. So I said to him, why do you do all these dumb rituals, right? You're smarter than that. And his answer was, well, I do it, it keeps the family together. He was an immigrant, and my uncles and aunts were immigrants. So it keeps the family together. I didn't think anything of it. The dream did seem a little more real than the usual dream. But 25 years later, I'm, how old would I be? In my mid-30s, beginning to get into this stuff, to looking at parapsychology. And my uncle was the only person in the family I had an adult relationship with. So I talked to him about that dream. And I think he spilled his coffee. He says, that's just what your grandfather would have said. I said, you mean he didn't believe in the religion? He says, no, he didn't believe it at all. He just did this stuff to keep the family together. Because the family had to come to his house on Passover and Hanukkah. And Friday nights too. So here I had an ADC. I didn't realize it was. I didn't believe it was until I had, 25 years later, validation from my uncle. And then I wondered how many other things did I miss in my life.
Someone from home has written in, other than statistics, is there any other way that science can reach into the areas that you are talking about?
Yes. Yes. And this is through, simply through sharing. Psychologists, like therapists, don't use statistics very much, right? But they create a safe space for people to open up and share very meaningful things that happen. The therapist can do that with 10, 20, 30 patients, can then get together with other therapists. They can compare the stories, and some common themes can come out. And that, to me, is just as scientific as statistical analyses.
I think a paradox for me personally was that I was very scientifically based, very evidence-based. And so many weird things kept happening that it became scientifically impossible. And that blew my mind. And then that's when I was able to really start digging and investigating and seeing the legitimacy of all this. It's really true.
Yeah. So that's interesting. How many of you came to, what shall we call this, spirituality? Or this kind of worldview? How many came to it because of some personal experience or experiences that forced you to it? So raise your hand and look around. I just want you to see. See, it looks almost half. I came up mostly out of intellectual curiosity. Are there any therapists in the room? Okay. I was dead from the neck down. Right? So I was that typical male intellectual, right? So I needed to be hit over the head by science,
I had
data,
so much
argument.
Synchronicity. I was like, I literally, my mind was blown, literally. I dropped my practice overnight because I'm like, no way this can be happening. And so I can write a book. I mean, so many things. I've written them down, you know, because I am so evidence-based, and I could, just bizarre. So real.
There's a new book you might enjoy. What's her name? Marjorie Woolacott. And she's a neuroscientist. And she said she's been a typical atheist, materialist neuroscientist all her life, but she was also a meditator and had very powerful experiences in meditation that she couldn't explain in terms of her neuroscience. But she lived with this kind of schizophrenic, okay, my right brain's over here and left brain's over here, and the two aren't going to talk to each other.
Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. She finally, I think around 60, got tired of that and has put it two together, and now she just wrote a book, a little bit personal, but also theoretical, and I forget that. But Marjorie Woolacott, two O's and two L's.
Thank you, Professor Grossman.
Neal.
I wasn't going to say anything, but John made me. I very much object to your use of the word scientific. You used the word scientific in a number of situations where, let's say, at least in the classical sense, it is definitely not scientific. All your evidence that I've seen is not all. Most of your evidence is anecdotal, and you use the word scientific right there. And I think if you claim a scientific background, you should at least mention the fact that there is classical explanation. For instance, the near-death experience, you say it's internally caused. That's internally created. You said
Not sure
something.
what you mean by that.
Maybe
What I said
maybe I
is
misunderstood.
there is no explanation of why only 15 to 20% of people
Okay.
in a certain physiological condition of heart not beating report a near-death experience. We have no explanation for that.
But we can create it there's a couple of terms. You say people are brain dead. Nobody's ever come back from being brain dead. People have come back from their heart stopping. The heart stopping does not mean the brain stops. So that is scientifically, there's a different twist there. That
Okay.
word is not correct.
I'm not going to respond to your question because I'm not a cardiologist, but I've heard Eben Alexander respond exactly to that question, giving the neurological details that I do not understand. So the answer to your question is there, but it's not here.
But if you go into, let's say, explanations of near-death experiences, we can create it. We know exactly the point of the brain where that creates the image of self that we feel we are inside of your body. We can take magnetically disable it, and you will see yourself floating out of your body. We can do the same thing with the sense of self and turn it off, and you get the same experience. Those near-death experience, if you look at the experiences of people that we can do in the lab, match almost too perfectly with the near-death experiences with people who had insufficient blood to their brain. So, I mean,
Okay, may I respond to that?
Yes, please.
And I'm going to respond the same way I did before, that I myself am convinced of the reality of the near-death experience. So I don't need the argument. I've gone through it already myself. But these questions that you're asking have been raised in print and have been responded to in print by cardiologists, brain surgeons, and whatever. What you're saying is not true. The near-death experience cannot be duplicated. It has never been duplicated. But you need to understand the phenomenology of the near-death experience, right? It is not just some fuzzy sensation of perceiving your body from an external perspective, right? There is no physiological correlate with the near-death experience, and it just hasn't been. So I'm not going to try to respond to you because I don't have the technical vocabulary in my heart, but I do know that this has been discussed in the literature, and that all the scientists who have studied the near-death experience conclude differently from you, that it cannot be and has not been duplicated ever. You have to understand the phenomenology of the near. You have to know what a near-death experience is and what it's talking about. Now, the use of the word science and scientific, this is one of those words that has different meanings to different people. And I think I may tend to use it not the way mainstream scientists would use it. My son is a mainstream scientist at MIT, and I think he might not agree with my use of it. The broad use of it is the work that scientists do, using the methodology that they were trained to in graduate school and in laboratories over the years. These are scientists who have had successful careers in other areas, right? Using the same methodology, but applying it to this kind of phenomena. So their approach is scientific because they are scientists. Their approach is, they ask questions, they rule out other variables, confounding variables. They do a double blind, triple blind under tight controls, and this is the data that they report. All of their work, I say, is scientific because they report what they did in the lab, they report what they observed, they list all the hypotheses that might be consistent with the data, they give reasons for preferring one over the other, over the others. That to me is a scientific approach to anything. Now, for some people, the word scientific, my old mentor, Houston Smith, made a big deal of this, the difference between science and scientism. And some people confuse science with scientism. And here again, you know, even those words, people use it in different ways. But for me, scientism is the belief that the theories we now have are complete and final and adequate for explaining everything. That is not science, right? Right? The scientism of the late 19th century, right? Those people were up in arms against relativity, what, time's not absolute, and the quantum theory, right? So the belief that the scientific theories we now have are complete and will never be replaced by anything different or better, and hence there can be nothing that contradicts the theories that we have, that to me is almost a religious, a doctrinaire attitude towards science. That's scientism. That to me is not science. Right? Science is in continual flux. And it's always been the case in the history of science that the ideas that we think are, well, we pretty much have it now. I lost something or other. You know, sure enough, get replaced. There's a funny story. The guy who did the experiment that Einstein based his relativity on, got the negative result of the motion to the ether. Oh, what was it? The Michelson-Morley experiment. Michelson, in the 1890s, was advising his students not to major in physics because physics was complete, right? There's not going to be any more stuff, right? And within 20 years, you had relativity and the quantum theory. So there's that openness to new ideas. Now, I could have been, you could probably find scientists who will agree with you or disagree with the way I was, maybe a sloppy way of using it, but I'm using it in a very open way. These are what some scientists are studying and studying very seriously.
Well, and right along those lines, as far as being open to new ideas and the concepts that we're talking about, I'm curious to know, this is newer for me. I just recently discovered this site at all, and I think it's really cool that it's here and that you guys offer topics like this to do lectures. When you were talking about reincarnation, past life regression, mediums, me being more of a science background and just kind of coming into this awakening and the belief in life being bigger than us, I find myself struggling with, if you were trying to find somebody that's a medium or somebody that offers past life regression, how do you even go about that I mean, and I'm open to anybody's ideas here. I don't know if there's any type of metaphysical meetings that they do where you have an opportunity to meet people, or if it's all word of mouth, because honestly, I don't know a lot of people that through word of mouth that we would be having this discussion. I'm being honest about that.
Yeah.
So how do you even go about that? Anybody?
If you're new to it, I mean, I wouldn't just go online and look something, because what I found in my personal explorations is I never met anyone who's an outright fraud, but I did meet mediums whose abilities were not as developed as they thought they were. Right. So okay. So how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And I word of mouth is one way. I've been going to the Church of the Spirit, where all the pastors are trained mediums. And the first time I went, so everyone who goes there gets a brief message from Spirit. It's not supposed to be evidential, just whatever comes. But the first time I went there, the message changed my life. And I've been going regularly ever since. Also nice people there. Not always accurate. Sometimes they'll give me a message and say, huh, what? Right? But sometimes it is so right. And I also look around when she's giving a message. There are about 30, 40 people. I sit up front so I can look at see people's faces as they're receiving messages. And sometimes you go, oh, like that. And sometimes the person's just standing there blank, but their partner is going, yep. Yeah. Yep. You've had that too, I bet. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. I just want to add maybe, it's just like if you're seeking for any expertise in any field, you've got to be a discriminating shopper, regardless of what it is. Now, and especially if it's something that's going to influence you in a deep way. So, if you visit, say, the Quest bookshop, there you will also find magazines with many, many lists of people working in these various fields. And some of them are very reliable and good, I feel, reputable. There may be some who are not. So there's plenty out there. It's not a shortage. Be selective, discriminate, use your own personal intelligence and wisdom, and always reevaluate.